Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Heather Staines. I'm very excited to be here with you today to moderate this webinar on World Digital Preservation Day. Preservation, more work to be done, digital preservation challenges and opportunities. I am a senior consultant with DeltaThink, and I also do some publisher and integrator outreach for some STM solutions initiatives, Get FTR, and Seamless Access. So you may have seen me in some of those capacities. But digital preservation is one of my long running interests. Before we kick off today, introducing our speakers, I would just like to highlight that STM is committed to complying with all applicable competition and antitrust laws. Webinar participants must refrain from disclosing or asking about competitively sensitive information and shall not solicit any agreement regarding any competitor's conduct in the marketplace. If a panelist or audience member believes any information or agreement is being disclosed or sought, that individual should promptly interrupt to point out their objections and request that such activity be stopped and leave the webinar. If it does not stop, and any such communication shall promptly be reported to the STM staff. Just a couple words of housekeeping. You can see by your screen that this webinar is being recorded. You will receive a recording later, and anyone who registered and was not able to attend today will also receive the recording, and you can share that on to other folks at your organization or other folks you think might be interested. We will have a couple of brief presentations. We'll hold our questions until after the speakers have finished. I would say if there is a point where it's just really a clarity or confusion, try to put that in the chat and we'll try to keep an eye on that. But otherwise, you can put your questions in the chat for us to answer at the end. And as we are a small group, we can probably even let you unmute and ask the question. Just put your hand up and I will call upon you. So we have three panelists joining today. I'll just give a brief introduction, although I'm sure you probably know them already. Kate Wittenberg is Managing Director of Portico. She oversees execution of a strategic vision for Portico that is deeply informed by the role of scholarly publishers and academic libraries in response to demonstrated preservation needs of the international higher education community. Kate will be speaking first. Next up will be Alicia Wise. Alicia is Executive Director of CLOCKSS, where research libraries and academic publishers come together to ensure the long-term preservation of the scholarly record. She's been active in increasing access to research information and roles within the academic, library, and publishing communities in a variety of different contexts, Archaeology Data Service, JISC, the Publishers Association, the Publishers Licensing Service, and Elsevier. And rounding out our speakers for today is Ian Mulvaney. Ian is CTO at BMJ, where he leads teams that deliver the technologies and features that underpin new products, as well as underlying publishing systems. He is responsible for leading on technology strategy for the company and understanding the implications of new and emerging technologies for the business. He's also here today with additional hat on, which is board member for the Dryad repository. So I'm going to hand over to Kate and I'll be driving the slides for our first two speakers, so just let me know when to advance.
Thank you so much, Heather. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks to everyone who's joining us. So I thought we'd just start with a very, very brief overview of what we're all talking about when we say digital preservation. Now, people use slightly different terminology, but I think most people agree that digital preservation is here to ensure that valuable resources in electronic form remain secure and available for future generations of scholars, researchers, and students. And when we talk about preservation, we mean like really into the future, not just a few years, but generations if we're doing our job right. Next slide. So what do the participants in a digital preservation service need? Because these are CLOCKSS and Portico, as well as other preservation services, are very much informed by the community's needs. And there are two parts of the community that we think about, which is the publishing community or content providers more generally, and the library community and their end users. So what do publishers need? They want to know that they can trust any preservation service to keep their content dark and safe and secure for the very long term, except in a trigger scenario when we light it up because it's no longer available from the content provider site. And if we're doing our jobs properly, the end user will just maintain access to this content without knowing that there's a whole lot going on under the hood, with a lot of people making sure and figuring out how that will happen seamlessly. Libraries and their end users, on the flip side, want to know that preservation services have publisher content safe and secure and ready to be made accessible, hopefully as soon as it's needed. Next slide. Just a quick overview of where Portico is now. So we have 1,290 libraries participating, 1,100 publishers, 41,000 e-journals, 2 million plus ebooks, and 462 digital collections, which are what we call large reference types of digital publications, usually archival primary source materials. Next slide. So with that sort of content base in a dark archive, there's lots and lots of day-to-day, week-to-week, year-to-year work that we have to do to get the content in, to format it, to make sure that it's ready to be preserved, then preserve it, and then monitor it to make sure that we don't need to make it available through lighting it up through a trigger scenario. So we're doing all of that. However, as we all know, the environment out there is rapidly changing. We need to figure out how we're going to maintain our ability to deal with continuing preservation needs as they develop from the community. Particularly in a couple of areas, content is becoming more complex. I'll talk about that more in a second. And we need to be able to preserve new types of content that are at risk, and particularly types of content coming perhaps from non-traditional sources. Next slide. So for complex content, at Portico right now, we're nearing the end of a multi-year research project that we're doing with partners, including LOCKSS and CLOCKSS, as well as some scholarly publishers and platform providers. And the purpose of this research, which is funded by the Mellon Foundation, is to figure out how we're going to be able to preserve new types of born digital content that we call complex or dynamic. And what we mean by that are things that have elements such as software, notations, either from the author or from the reader, interactive maps, audio and video elements that are linked to from the scholarly publication. These are very different types of elements than what we've seen in the past, which are basically text-based publications that have become digital. And we have to figure out how we're going to preserve these in a way that's sustainable and scalable. And so the goal of this project is to actually influence the workflow of the content providers, publishers, and their authors as they're developing the publications, so that throughout the process, they're thinking about ways to make these sorts of materials more preservable, perhaps by clearing all the rights at the beginning, embedding things in the body of the work rather than linking out to YouTube, etc. Things that might seem simple, but that because this is also new, a lot of publishers and their authors aren't thinking about, so that preservation ideally becomes a collaborative process rather than a massive cleanup operation for the preservationists at the end of this spectrum of activity. So the goal is to support the whole community as we continue to create this type of content, and then to build expertise in the preservation community to deal with it. Next slide. On the other side of things, which I mentioned, that is content that might be coming from less traditional sources, we have a pilot project going on at Portico, which we're calling Preserving Underrepresented Content. What we're doing in this project is to try to understand what's involved in preserving at-risk content that focuses on underrepresented communities or topics and that may come from the, sources that are outside of the traditional publishing and library cycle of content production. So these might be community archives, for example, that are created by volunteers who are looking to safeguard important materials about a topic, but they're not embedded within a traditional library, publishing, or preservation space. So what we're looking at is what are the challenges? What makes this something that we'd either be able to do or find difficult? So this has to do with file formats that are not traditionally publishers' formats, storage needs, rights issues, and privacy for some of this sensitive material. So we're trying to look at how to identify the material, create a system for preserving it that's scalable, and then show the content producers that this content will be cared for with respect and long-term commitment from anyone coming to them to ask to preserve their content. Next slide. So this is a really quick overview of some of the things we're looking at, and I just wanted to add some final thoughts about this. While services such as Portico and CLOCKSS have succeeded for many years now in preserving scholarly content in a secure environment supported by effective business models, we need to be prepared constantly for new challenges that are rapidly developing in the environment. And so we need to adapt to changing needs, to changing environments, and we need to be innovative and be willing to respond constantly to opportunities that are arising and that support the community's needs as they evolve. That's it for me, and I'll turn things over to Alicia.
Thank you so much, Kate. Happy World Preservation Day, everybody. And it's a real privilege to be here with Kate and Heather and Ian too. So let's get started. Next slide, please. Just a little introduction to CLOCKSS. If you're not familiar with our service, we're a not-for-profit digital archive owned and governed by academic libraries and academic publishers around the world. We are very affordable, and we hold the highest ever accreditation score awarded by the Center for Research Libraries, which we're very proud of. Next slide, please. We also make sustaining financial contributions to a much broader array of digital archive services built around the LOCKSS open source preservation software. And these services in combination protect over 5,000 unique journal titles, which is in addition to the 2,000 unique journal titles that CLOCKSS holds. And it's a real privilege to be able to support library-based preservation efforts at the grassroots as well. Next slide, please. So picking up a theme that Kate has already introduced, I'm going to go rapidly today through some current innovation projects that are underway. And this is not to boast or to bore you especially, but to convey a sense of dynamism. The digital preservation of even journals and books is not a done deal. There's much more work to do. And then there's this exciting world of related scholarly outputs, formally and informally disseminated. There is an enormous amount of work underway here. We've already seen that from Kate's presentation. And this area, for most publishing houses, I would argue, is much more strategic than it might look at on the surface. Next slide, please. So the first three projects I'm going to mention have been developed and delivered by a really terrific working group over the last 18 months. And these people, some of the names might be familiar to you, have come from publishing companies, they've come from libraries, and they've come from intermediaries of various kinds and standards bodies. They've worked together, they've climbed learning curves about digital preservation or the other stakeholder perspectives. And the first thing that they've delivered is on the next slide. Thank you. So the group has created a guide written for publishers. It talks about the drivers for digital preservation, but it also talks about common concerns or misperceptions and how to overcome those. There's something for every aspect of a publishing organization, whether it's senior leadership, people in editorial or rights or production and beyond. It's written in a non-jargony way. It's really friendly and accessible. And I would invite you to check it out. It's also service provider neutral. So it talks about Portico and national libraries, CLOCKSS, and other ways that content can be preserved for future generations. The next slide, thank you very much, is to really look at how to make it easier and more scalable and more cost efficient to preserve books in particular for the very long term. So we have, as a preservation community, really benefited from the fact that PDFs have an archival standard, but this has been lacking for EPUB formatted ebooks in particular. So working with ISO, the International Standards Organization, and the W3C, which champions the EPUB standard, we have worked together to create a draft archival standard for the EPUB format. This is now going through a formal ISO process. There's an international call out for experts to join the formal working group that will shepherd it through that ISO process. And the expectation is that this will be minted as a fresh international standard in about 18 months' time. And the exciting thing is that the archival standard is a subset of what you can do with an EPUB to make it more preservable, but you don't have to do anything extra to make your EPUB formatted books accessible. So watch this space out. We'll be coming out formally in about 18 months' time. Next slide, please. Now, I don't know if you've seen it, but Martin Eve has published a really sobering article using Crossref data. He has determined that about 75% of the journals that are indexed in Crossref are preserved someplace in at least one digital preservation service. We recommend at least 3 as good practice, but at least they're in one. But the sobering part is that that means that 25% of journals with DOIs are not preserved, as far as we can tell, in any digital archive. And the situation with books is even more worrying because it's impossible at the moment to calculate the equivalent figure. This is because there's no international registry that shows you which books are preserved where. And so the third project that working group has been looking on is trying to solve this problem, to make it discoverable about which ebooks are preserved where. And we've approached this through a multi-stakeholder approach. The ONYX metadata standard has evolved and can now enable publishers to actually signal where they're archiving, who their archiving partners are. There's a standardized way for us archives to signal what we're holding. So libraries can do a check to make sure that the assertions are confirmed by the archives. And by working with services like WorldCat and Gobi and Nielsen Book Data, it's possible for librarians to discover easily in their workflows what is happening on the ground. Next slide, please. So we're really grateful to these publisher participants, TNF, Cambridge University Press, Channelview, Amsterdam University Press, and the Royal Society of Chemistry for partnering with us and for adding the necessary metadata into their ONYX fields. Absolutely brilliant, and really, really appreciate publishers getting actively involved in this kind of innovation work. Next slide, please. One of the last areas I wanted to talk about is related to sustainability. And this is about the fact that digital preservation needs to be financially sustainable, but we need to think more about how to make sure it's environmentally sustainable as well. So CLOCKSS has got involved with the DIMPACT project, which is an initiative supporting a wide range of creative industry and media organizations to work out what their carbon footprints are. And we've done some work to just explode out and bring detail to a little box that many of them had on their own carbon workflows around preservation. So what we have been doing is explained on the next slide. Thank you. To calculate your carbon footprint, I've been on a steep learning curve about this. We've needed to gather an enormous amount of data from across all of the host institutions that keep copies of the CLOCKSS archive. So Stanford, Rice, Indiana, the University of Edinburgh, many others around the world. And colleagues there in the libraries have worked with their computing service colleagues to actually find out about how much energy we're using. The takeaways from this, which we are preparing to publish, are a workflow diagram that shows where carbon is created in the digital preservation process. We're now working with other archives to generalize that model so it could be used more broadly, with the aim of developing a standardized way so that preservation services could compare and contrast services and make more strategic decisions about the long-term preservation of content. And just to give away the punchline, the bottom line of this, the CLOCKSS archive, we generate about 9 tons of carbon a month, which is the equivalent of running a fleet of 20 cars. And that's been surprising to us in many ways. It was actually lower than we initially expected it would be, quite significantly lower. But contrast that to one face-to-face meeting a year where our international participants gather, and that meeting alone has the same carbon footprint as a whole month of running the digital archive. So just mind expanding, actually, to think now about how we make sure that our operations, our community, contribute to environmental stability and sustainability in the long term. And then the last slide, please. We're looking very thoughtfully at diversity, equity, and inclusion, both in how our community grows and is engaged. We're active in 66 countries, but there are many more where the long-term preservation of scholarship is relevant. And we're also looking at our collections policy much more closely, looking for patterns about which languages are preserved, which countries content is flowing in from or being accessed, and working with and through libraries to reach scholars, to identify different collecting priorities that will make sure that we're representing a range of views going forward. And we're also pleased to be looking at and now making proposals for implementing the new Plan S pricing framework to foster global equity in scholarly publishing as well. And with that, I'll end. Thank you very much indeed. And over to Ian.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Alicia. Ian is going to be sharing his slides, so we're going to be putting those up. I know I've jotted down a lot of questions and notes so far, so looking forward to getting your perspective. Ian, are you able to share?
Thank you very much. I think I am. Is that okay?
Yep, looks good.
Thank you, everyone. I just have a couple of slides to introduce some of the organizations that I represent. So I am the Chief Technology Officer at the British Medical Journal, and we have been around since 1840, which is quite a while for a journal. We've published things like the discovery of chloroform, antisepsis, and we now serve international communities with a goal to provide better evidence, better decisions, and better systems for healthcare. But some reflections on that is from going from purely print in 1840, and I think we've got about 1.5 million articles in our archive, and our archive includes contributions from Charles Dickens on the Great Stink of the 1860s, and contributions which led to making it illegal to sell babies in the UK at a time when that was something that people could do. And we're now increasingly creating more digitally native content and data, things built on top of knowledge graphs, videos, First-Class Citizen. But when I came in as CTO, I discovered things like, because of the age and depth of our archive, some of our internal data systems indicated that we had over several thousand different article types. And that's probably just because of drift in metadata over time. Also discovered things like, for some of our product folk, it was easier for them to get our abstracts from PubMed than it was going into internal systems. And so I think like this question about how you do good digital conservation, preservation isn't only about preserving the scholarly record. It can be a really operational benefit to organizations that do it well. And we're all kind of on that journey at BMJ. Dryad is another organization that I'm involved with. It's a not-for-profit membership organization. I am the treasurer for Dryad in a pro bono capacity. And we're an open data publishing platform, and we make data openly available. And that's primary research data. And we work hard to support authors. One of the key things about Dryad is every data set that is deposited receives human curation and human review, because we think it's important to not only deposit the data, but you need to make that data discoverable, to make it reusable, to make it valuable. And so we're constantly trying to help our authors in areas about how to prepare data management plans, how to comply with policies for data sharing, how to publish their data quickly and easily. For example, creating reasonable and high quality readmes for rapid data publication, informing them about the importance of PIDs and how they amplify the impact of their data, and keeping up to date with the ability to version data. And so I've just posted a couple of examples of cool data sets that we published recently. And we think that there are further opportunities for data to support machine learning tools, automating template creation. This is just a quick view on how we try to make that data more discoverable and reusable. And as I said, we're a membership organization. These are some of our institutional members. These are some of our publishing members, and we've brought a couple of new members on over the last year. The key thing, though, my perspective on Dryad is one of our grand challenges over the next couple of years is going to be to understand how to make the system properly sustainable, because doing this kind of preservation and doing this kind of annotation on the data is expensive. How do we get to a place where those costs are transparent? How do we get to a place where those costs are shared equitably amongst the many different stakeholders, so that we have a long-term system that is sustainable and that continues to make that data valuable and reusable? And with that, I will stop sharing. And I'll hand back to you, Heather.
You, Ian. And can I ask Alicia and Kate if they're able to turn their cameras back on? Kate, you're also muted. Okay, maybe Kate.
Yeah, I can unmute, but it's not letting. Oh, here we go. You're letting me. Okay.
Okay. There's Kate. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate those, quick overviews. I anticipated we would have folks on this call that might have a little bit of knowledge about digital preservation, and then on the other end, folks who are coming that have a lot of knowledge. So I've got a couple of questions to kick us off with, but as I said, we're a small group, and if you want to unmute and come on screen and ask your question, just raise your hand and I will be happy to do that. I want to maybe start for a question for Kate, but it's definitely anyone can chime in. You mentioned dynamic content and how that's becoming more of a challenge, and this has been an issue. I think it's great that folks are finally looking at it, because it's not a new issue. Years and years ago at ALA, I presented in the RUSA division about preserving book-like objects, and I had the Harry Potter monsters, Book of Monsters, on my slide, which I couldn't probably do now for copyright. But how do you deal with these things that are somewhat like books but have lots of interesting or dynamic elements? At one point I remember somebody maybe from University of Michigan library telling me that in order to preserve something, you basically had to destroy it, because you were taking snapshots or basically trying to make something dynamic into something flat. Can we talk a little bit more about what might be possible now that wasn't possible in the past, Kate? And then I'll move on to the other speakers.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think one of the most interesting issues that's coming up in this research project is the conversations, the things that are coming out of the conversations with the publishers and with their authors about what exactly needs to be preserved from some of these works. That is it really important to you as a scholar, for example, to preserve the archival materials that are going into this, or the data that's going into this work? Or is it equally important to preserve the way in which the whole object is presented to the reader and the experience of the reader? In which case, you're right, Heather, now you can talk about emulation environments in which you're actually trying to recreate the environment in which the material was presented by the author and the publisher, in addition to preserving these pieces of that experience. So it's a discussion in progress. The costs of emulation for some of these highly complex objects could be a problem in terms of making the preservation scalable and sustainable. And so in those cases, would it be enough to preserve the pieces and knowing that if you had to, you could put them back together? Or in other cases, is it just not enough to preserve the pieces? And so you have to make the investment to preserve the experience. And so I don't think there's an either or answer. I think it's going to come down to a discussion about individual works. But Alicia and Ian, tell me if you have thoughts.
Thanks for that perspective, Kate. And it made me think about an article I read a couple years ago about early video games being preserved. And so many of those are not preserved necessarily in any way. And if you're going to preserve a video game, of course, you're going to want to have a way to play it. And that's kind of the context where I learned a little bit about emulators. Alicia?
Yeah, this resonates with my experience back in the archaeology data service, where in the 1990s, we began assembling a digital archive. And some of the material was very easy to preserve, the Word documents with reports, whatever. But most of it was just a different kettle of fish. We had interactive web pages that couldn't be rendered in print or were context dependent. They varied by the queries that the user put into them at a particular point of time. And so we had an array of approaches to preserving this material. Sometimes it was easy, but oftentimes we had to look. Sometimes snapshots were completely acceptable as a way of capturing the resources. But oftentimes we actually had to disassemble the data sets. We needed to look at whether the images and the video and the data sets could be preserved independently and their interrelationships and how they needed to fit back together to recreate that experience could be documented, fresh metadata created, and those materials reassembled in new environments. And the sad news is that sometimes these resources are not preservable, even with emulation environments. It just underpins that the importance of standards and encouraging data creators, authors and publishers to think really carefully in advance about what needs to be preserved, as Kate has eloquently said, and actually how they're going to make that possible, and inculcating that as part of our behaviors, about part of our strategy when we're first envisioning a digital project.
Yeah, and Ian?
I wonder if the tooling we have, as it changes, will change the picture on that. So on the software engineering side, we're increasingly moving to using containers where the artifacts that we deploy into production are static. They don't have any moving bits because the moving bits are built into this container. And when you do a software update, you don't update the software in live. You replace it with a static container in your other container. You can preserve and go back and when Jupyter Notebooks came into existence, I remember thinking about how we might make things that are more easily maintainable or even bring more interactivity to the web as scholarly objects. And already since then, the tooling for these kinds of things has come on in leaps and bounds, driven by the need for big tech to have scalable infrastructures. But even then, I think that in the last year, we're seeing high performance languages like Rust come to play, where you take the same model, but get a couple of orders of magnitude of efficiency by rebuilding it in a language that is significantly more performant. And so I think that you have an issue there, that the things themselves are becoming more complex, and the tools you might draw to preserve them, that's a landscape that is also moving. And how you make the right choice with those moving parts, I don't have an answer to, but it's an interesting puzzle.
When we did the planning call for this session, Ian, you said that it was really important to think in terms of boring technology because of complexity of the objects. Can you explain a little bit to the folks here what you mean by that?
Yeah, so when we do the software engineering side of things, a new framework can come along and engineers can get very excited about it. But unless you have a sufficient number of people in the world who know that technology, when you adopt something new, you open yourself to risk that the technology goes out of fashion. And when it goes out of fashion, then the cost of working in that technology goes up. And so even though it isn't as sexy, picking the boring choice can often be the one that's more cost effective and scalable. And so at least the things with containers, they have got mainstream adoption, and that is a good thing. But things like these new high performant languages are still in that envelope of to be assessed rather than adopted. And actually, a pattern that I would really recommend people to look at is there's an organization called ThoughtWorks, and every year they publish a technology radar, and they have, for different tools, their recommendation on whether something should be investigated, trialed, adopted, or abandoned. And that might be quite a nice framework for us to think about within our space as a collective.
Be the boring scale.
Yeah.
I've got one more question before we'll go to open it up a little bit, and it's for Alicia. I'm currently the board liaison at the NASIC Library Association for the Digital Preservation Committee, where Alicia and I and Michelle on this call also serve. And as part of that committee, a subgroup worked on a model preservation policy. And one of the questions, to put out to folks, typically could be libraries, but could also be publishers, is deciding what needs to be preserved. But I want to take that maybe to a little bit of a more of a meta level, because you touched on underrepresented content, and so did Kate. Who should decide? Who should get to decide what gets preserved?
And I'm not sure there's any single body or perspective. What we're trying to do is be more inclusive, to let more people get involved in the decision making. So one of the projects that we're working on is working with colleagues at Howard University, which is a historical Black college or university in the United States, engaging with librarians who might not be digital preservationists, but getting them involved in identifying scholarly outputs and scholarly material that they are interested in, that their community is interested in, that is perhaps published, but not yet included in any of the scholarly archives. This is just one example. At CLOCKSS, our collections policy is informed by the libraries who are in our community. So we're happy to preserve anything that is relevant for being collected by an academic library. And we really rely on those librarians telling us what's meaningful for them and for their patrons. And I've been really impressed with how libraries themselves are excellent at getting into the research communities on their campuses to have those kinds of discussions. We need more of this, more roundup informing of preservation and archive collection policies.
Yeah, Kate, I see you nodding in agreement.
Yeah, I am. And I also think complementing what Alicia said is the issue of who has or doesn't have the resources to make preserving their content possible. And so the economic, as well as the social and cultural and issues that make things underrepresented, I think are important to include in thinking about this.
Yeah, and Ian, I imagine the conversation at Dryad as well.
On that, I think one perspective that we have on this is just about what we're observing in terms of the growth of the size of data that people are depositing. And so Dryad out of the door can take deposits of up to 10 gigabytes. But we're seeing an increasing number of data sets coming in that are heavier than that in size. And it's not so much the cost of the preservation, but more the cost of the curation when your data sets get very large. And so I think there's a surcharge now for data that we're considering of data sets that are above a certain threshold. We can take data sets of almost like an elastic size, certainly up to 200 gigabytes fairly easily. But the question is the business model or the sustainability model also there to be able to work with the heterogeneity of types of objects that need to be preserved? So there's the question of who gets to decide, but then there's also the question of, can it be sustainably preserved as well in a world where there's more complexity and more scale?
Mm-hmm. And speaking of complexity and scale, Hilke, you put a question in the chat. Do you want to just ask that question? Because I think.
Yeah, sure. And first, let me thank the speakers. It was great to hear about, the sense of innovation in energy, speaking about digital preservation. So great to hear. My question is sort of riffing off your comment, Alicia, about the challenge of preserving context-dependent material or context-dependent experiences. The question that's been on my head for some time is, if you think about generative AI, large language models that are intermediating between the scholarly record and a researcher and a scholar, and sort of used to interrogate the scholarly record, and that becomes another building block for new knowledge. How could that potentially be preserved? Like, and is there any way to make that feasible, or in your view, is that even desirable to think about that? So should we think about preservation of, that intermediate shackle of the published scholarly record, and then the outcome of an LLM that interrogates the scholarly record before it is brought to a researcher as yet another building block in the chain of knowledge?
Hilke, I love your questions because they're always mind expanding. So it's actually not something I've thought about before. We're focused on formally communicated scholarly outputs. And if a scholar has used an LLM in that production process, I guess we wouldn't know about it at the moment necessarily unless they've disclosed this, and we wouldn't have thought about preserving that tool any more than we would think about preserving other tools that they might have used to create their output. That having been said, if this were felt to be useful, I'm sure LLMs can be preserved, whether you would do that as a snapshot, whether you would try to keep track of what content was available to be queried.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know off the top of my head. Ian might know immediately, but you need to do it, I guess, is the question I would have.
The Open Data Institute here in the UK are developing a protocol called CLOCKSS to make it more transparent what goes into the making of an LLM in a machine readable way. And so that would be an initiative that I would point people towards. I only found out about it at a conference on Tuesday, by the way. So, yeah.
Great, thank you.
Great. I was trying to look up croissant real quickly, but it was making me hungry. So we have another question from Michelle. Michelle, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Recently, Project Lend did an user study with researchers asking them about the formats that they want to see in books. And because they're used to working with PDFs, they want PDFs. So how do you approach the tension between current usage, which might be lending an ebook, or being able to download it just for your current research because all your other files are in PDF, and then the ebook EPUB format comes along and makes everyone nervous just in their daily workflows. So you have that tension between preservation and current usage or kind of culturally accepted standards that may feel intimidating to come in and introduce a new format.
Michelle, this is a great question. So it is possible to preserve books in multiple formats, and that might be the easy way at present. But I'm going to actually really champion the EPUB standard for a minute, because it's widely deployed in trade publishing, and it's not so widely used in the academic community, which seems ironic to me, because the key driver for its creation was accessibility for people with print disabilities. It is fantastic if you have physical or visual challenges that make it hard for you to interact with a PDF. And this is an area I've done a lot of work on. And one of the surprising things that we learned here in the UK at UK universities was that there was a lot of resistance on university campuses from students who had support for print disabilities of various kinds to switch from PDFs where they were comfortable over to EPUBs, which were hugely more accessible to them. So there's a real upskilling, confidence building challenge. It's about digital skills building for our undergraduates and postgraduates and academic colleagues. It's not a done deal, but that is something really worth leaning into. And I think librarians have a really powerful role to play, but people will move at different times and different speeds. And there's no reason not to support both at the current time.
Thanks.
I'm talking away and I'm unmuted. Does anyone else want to add anything? Do we have any other questions from our attendees? Because I have another question. I always have another question. Hilke.
I have another question as well, if that's all right, if no one else would like to use that. Kate, you spoke about the need to take a look at publisher workflows to see how they could better capture the totality of scholarship. So not only the article, but also data sets, methodology, etc. I think that's what you have in mind. Do you have ideas of how we could start doing that? And are there existing standards, workflows that would provide a good starting point for that ambition? There was a question for Kate. I think you...
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you said Ian.
Yeah.
I meant to say Kate. Sorry, did I say you?
Sorry. No, that's fine. So you're asking in the workflow for a traditional publisher, what would be the starting point for introducing new ways of doing things?
Exactly. In one of your slides, you called out that, or you spoke about the need to sort of revise how we capture the totality of scholarship there. And I was wondering what would be a good starting point, a good entry point to do that.
Right. So in traditional publishing, which I used to work in, scholarly publishing, there's something called an author's questionnaire. I don't even know if anyone remembers those anymore, but it was a requirement that an author submitted before her manuscript went into the production workflow. And that asked lots of questions like, how many illustrations do you have? Do you have permission for all of them? Please document your permission. Do you have all of the high quality replications of those images? Do you have the ability to put captions under everything that you're adding? Do you have any data? It went through all of the additional materials in addition to the text that an author wished to include. And you literally wouldn't accept the manuscript in until an author at least made a good attempt to address those questions. To my knowledge, there's nothing quite like that for born digital publications when an author's, whatever submission is now, submits that. And I would say that I'd argue that if we could recreate something like that in the digital environment, then an author has to at least think about a list of things that we as preservationists or others all agree are important in the end, at the end of the process. it would do wonders for creating something that in the end is more preservable.
I saw a startup today that is trying to create something like a concierge service for authors to help them with their manuscript submission to journals, and it would be and it has the ability to help them with the bits of their paper that need to be reformatted to meet the needs of the submission guidelines of a journal. And it sounds like that's a nice attack vector, but it only works on the promise that it makes the workflow easier for the author. And if we have an idea, but we hope people will do something, unless it's making it easier for them, people are not going to do it. So we have to think about leveraging the opportunities that our digital infrastructures potentially may provide to us in the future to take burden away, to get higher quality metadata, I think.
I just want to hang out with all you guys and hear the things you're hearing. Alicia, you're opening your mouth.
I was just going to build on that by saying that there's also there are things that can be done now relatively easily by publishers. So, for example, many are disseminating data sets and resources that are associated with journals and books, and CLOCKSS, and I'm sure Portico as well, can ingest and preserve those related materials, but very few publishers deposit them at the minute. They don't think of us as places where they can preserve code and data and videos and images, but this is already the case, and we've been doing this for years. So please, if you're listening, do think about all of that material now that is affiliated with your journals and books, and make sure that that's there for the long term.
It's almost changing the definition of what the submitted work is. And in the born digital environment, there's no understood description of that. And I think that's exactly right, that it's not just the text, it's other things that go along that enhance or actually make the author's argument also have to be considered as part of what's preserved.
Mm-hmm. We're getting close to the end of our time. I want to thank our speakers and just say, if there's a call to action other than making sure your content is preserved, are there other ways people can get involved to advance this important initiative? Alicia.
Look at that guide to digital preservation written for publishers. I think if you do a Google search for CLOCKSS guide, you would get to it. And start a conversation in your publishing house about some of these issues. Are you preserving everything that you feel should be part of the long-term record? And if not, how can you do a little bit more to move in that direction?
Great. Same question, Kate.
I didn't mention, but one of the deliverables of this research project in embedding preservability is a tool that the people working on this project are actually going to create and release early next year as part of this project. That sounds a little bit like the guide Alicia's talking about, that it's something that publishers and their authors can actually look at and use almost as a checklist when they're deciding how to submit things for preservation and how to create things from the beginning so that they're more preservable.
Great. Ian?
So, we've had lots of really great questions that have come up over the course of this webinar, and in many cases, the answer has been, well, we need to talk about it. We need community involvement. We need engagement. There isn't an absolute answer to that. And I'd say, for standards, for the whole idea of digital preservation, it's not like there's any rule book out there that has come down from above and been granted to us. It emerges from the participation in people in the community groups. And I think all of our organizations, Dryad, CLOCKSS, LOCKSS, have roots for community participation. And we need people to turn up, and we need people to be parts of those communities, to give us your time and your insight. And so if you have any time and you have any interest, have a look and see if there's a place where you could contribute your expertise. It would be extraordinarily welcomed.
Yeah, and just to build on that, Ian, you mentioned again when we were getting ready for this that you can do a small bit that's going to make the future better. better. Even if you feel it's a small bit, it's a small bit that will be put together with those other small bits. I will also give a shout out again to the NASIG Digital Preservation Committee and that model preservation policy. Donna has reminded me that I should mention that STM is having the some events in London on December 3rd and 4th, the Innovation Day and Fair that will be at the World Congress if you're within striking distance of London or you want to make a mileage run before the end of the year. We have recorded this session today and we will make it available, as I mentioned. But with that, again, I'd like to thank STM for the opportunity to bring us together on this important World Digital Preservation Day. And thanks to our speakers for teaching us something today. Thank you so much. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank you,
Heather.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.